Hello, I'm Ollie. This is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror. I'm going to do a review of Robert R McCammon's mammoth Swan Song. So, like many of the books I talk about on my channel, I seem to say this a lot, this is a book I read when I was a teenager. And interestingly, my recollection of it was quite different from the book itself when I came to reread it. So when I say when I was a teenager, that's a long time ago. So I think I read this book at least 30 years ago, which is a long time in anyone's money, I think. And I remembered it taking place in a government underground bunker called Mount Cheyenne or something like that, and that place is mentioned once in the book, but the book doesn't take place there at all. But anyway, let's talk about what it's about. So it is a post-apocalyptic epic, somewhat in the vein of Stephen King's The Stand. It came out in, when did it come out? It came out in '87. So a good few years after The Stand. I think I'm right in saying it came out between the original edition of The Stand and the expanded edition of The Stand. And I think it's probably about midway between those two in terms of length. So I think the original edition of The Stand was kind of 800 pages-ish. And then the expanded edition is, I don't know, what is it, 1,200 pages or something like that? This is about 950, so kind of in the middle. And it's a really, really good read. People in my comments ribbing me about how quickly I read. And I do read quite quickly. I read this in 2.5 days, purely because it's so incredibly readable. So I'll give you a brief outline of the plot. So basically, it starts with a nuclear war between America and the Soviet Union. So, you know, it was written in the 80s. That's what it's going to be about. So the president of the US kind of unwillingly, shall we say, ends up starting this nuclear war, and you know, life as we know it is destroyed. And what we then get is a variety of storylines about different characters, and those storylines, you know, eventually all come together as they tend to in things like this. And the characters are fantastic. The characters are really, really good and really make the book. So there's a young girl called Swan, the Swan of the title, who has unusual powers, should we say. So it's interesting. I find it interesting that King does this in The Stand as well. It's not enough to write a book about the end of the world. You have to include some people with weird powers as well. So Swan's power is that she can make plants grow, basically. So she can encourage life in plants. So she has a pretty horrible life, you know, before the war. She lives with her mum, who's a stripper, basically, and one of her mum's boyfriends in his trailer, and he's absolutely horrible. So that's kind of her background. One of the other main characters is a black guy who's a wrestler who travels round the kind of local wrestling circuits and goes under the wrestling name Black Frankenstein. He's a fantastic character, really determined, powerful guy who makes a great character for the book. And then one of the other really interesting characters is this young guy whose name I forget now, who's basically his parents, his dad's quite wealthy, and he's kind of a survivalist, and has bought them a place in this huge bunker that's being built by this bunch of survivalists that's in the side of this mountain. And when they think that basically it's a weird, it feels like a bit of a weird arrangement in that it's kind of like a timeshare. So if you are part of this group that pay to like own a chunk of this place, you get to go there for 2 weeks a year and just kind of keep your fingers crossed that that's 2 weeks when the world ends. So anyway, they go. It's their 2 weeks in the bunker, and they go there. And the kid, who's this sort of weird, annoying, aggressive, creepy teenager, who's really into computer programming, is like really grumpy about going there. But then when the world ends, and he finds himself kind of in a position of power for various reasons, he gets to quite like it, and his true evil comes out. There's also a guy in the bunker as well who's like the kind of figurehead for the company that run it, who's like he's a retired Air Force colonel or something like that, who was shot down in Vietnam and survived being imprisoned by the Viet Cong for a year or something like that. So he's kind of constantly looking back at his glory days and trying to recover those and trying to lose the gut that he's built up over years of inactivity. So he's quite an interesting character as well. And there's a bunch more characters too, both good and bad. And as with The Stand, they kind of form together into a bunch of goodies and a bunch of baddies, and it gradually escalates into, a battle between the two forces, kind of pretty much inevitably. There's also, actually, the other really interesting character is there's a homeless woman from New York who's one of the characters who's brilliant, a really nicely written character. So she's a woman with kind of a tragic past who's turned to drink and lost everything, to dampen the pain of the tragedy in her past. Who, as once the world ends and she gradually comes back to sobriety, actually finds that she's still got a lot of inner strength and becomes a really pivotal. Sorry, can't speak. And becomes a really pivotal character in the book. And then there's also, and she meets him early on in the book, this mysterious, otherworldly, evil character who is very strange and clearly, meddling in human affairs, shall we say. So there's a lot of kind of supernatural, otherworldly stuff going on, as well as just the, Commonwealth Garden nuclear war. But it all comes together really well. And I think The Stand is a more ambitious book than this. This is fairly straightforward, I would say, but I prefer this. I think it's a more enjoyable book because The Stand is a bit, it's a bit too long. I mean, 950 pages is long enough, but 1200 is ridiculous. It's a bit, so The Stand's a bit too long, but it's also very patchy. Bits of it are fantastic and bits of it are pretty awful. And I would say Swan Song is never quite as good as The Stand at its best, but it's definitely always better than The Stand at its worst. So it's a more even book and very enjoyable as a result. So the story moves along at a decent clip despite the length of the book. And there are some absolutely fantastic action sequences in it. There's one in particular, this one sequence in a supermarket where there's all these like weird cannibalistic kind of freaky characters who are trying to capture two of the main characters in the book, and that sequence is one of the most exciting things I've read for ages. It was absolutely brilliant and really like cinematically written. It's got a real energy to it. It's some fantastic kind of action writing in here, which is really, really enjoyable. And as I say, the characters are all really well drawn, really interesting. And very readable and not. I hate the word relatable. I don't think it really works for a fantasy novel like this. But you understand their motivations. You understand why they're doing the things, and you root for them. The one thing I didn't like about the book, or thought was a bit strange, was it's really quite detailed in terms of it goes into quite a lot of depth describing what's happening, and it's a thick book, so it's pretty obvious he does that. So you've got, the beginning of the book, the build up to the nuclear war, the war itself, what happens to all the characters, and they're, gradually then trying to make a life for themselves again and survive in the post-nuclear wasteland. What then happens is halfway through the book, he just suddenly skipped forward 7 years. So he's been incredibly detailed about everything that happens for like a couple of months or something like that. And then he just skips forward 7 years and goes, yeah, this happened, that happened. And then he goes back to being incredibly detailed again. And I just found it a little bit jarring. I mean, once you get into the rhythm of it again after that 7-year leap, it's fantastic again. But yeah, I just found that a little bit odd. I thought there might have been a better way he could have handled that. But yeah, overall, a really good read. Not scary, I would have said, but definitely really tense, really suspenseful, really gripping. Some really interesting ideas in it, some great characters. And look at that cover on this old English, this old UK paperback. I mean, that is just a fantastic cover. I love that cover so much. So yeah, a really good, solid, post-apocalyptic mammoth. So if you're looking for a mammoth to read in 2022, I definitely recommend this one. As always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you found that interesting. Yeah, keep safe, keep well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Cheerio.